Welcome back for our second video sermon from Matthew, and this is video sermon number 18 in the iFaith series, and I've entitled it Righteousness, Not Religion. Last time, we looked at Jesus as the second Moses. It's quite clear that Matthew was portraying him this way. The first Moses went up on the mountain, and he was the lawgiver. He gave the very words of God. Jesus also goes up on the mountain. And as we saw, it's vital not to minimize what he taught. Jesus did not say, for example, just go and start churches in every nation, because the word really means peoples, and there are thousands, close to 20,000 people groups, only 195 nations. And yet, even then, though this is the Great Commission, Matthew 28 expects much more of us than just sharing the faith and helping people to be baptized. Because Jesus says in verse 20 that we are to teach them to obey everything I've taught you. He has all authority. Yes, we go to all peoples, but we're to teach all his commands, everything. And that means that most of the work of the disciple will happen in the mentoring, in the teaching, in the discipling area, not before baptism, but after. We also saw that Matthew is laid out in an alternation of deeds like miracles and teaching blocks. They're blocks of teaching, 5 in all, paralleling the Psalms and paralleling the Torah. Christians through the ages have always agreed that in the teaching blocks of Matthew, in fact, if we're going to look at all the Gospels, the heart of his teaching is Matthew 5 to 7, what is called the Sermon on the Mount. And that's where we're going to be focusing right now. I read this. When Jesus saw the crowds, he went up on the mountain. After he sat down, his disciples came to him. He opened his mouth and began to teach them, saying, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." I'm reading from the New American Standard. This should be very familiar. But to those who are familiar with the Old Testament, the idea that the Lord would go up on a mountain, things always happen on mountains, and particularly since Jesus is portrayed as the second Moses, this is going to tell us something. So he is going up on a mountain that's deliberate. This is traditionally somewhere very close to the Sea of Galilee. In fact, it would have to be relatively close if it's in Galilee. We'll be there in a few days, and it's not really that big a place. But it's significant that he goes up on the mountain. Luke has a sermon on the plain in Luke 6, the plain as in the flat area, but this is a sermon on the mount. So we're going to skim over chapters 5, 6, and 7, and then we'll come back to each chapter and make some application. But why here? Because for 2,000 years, most Christians, most kingdom Christians, most true Christians, born again by the Spirit, who put Jesus first, have intuitively understood this is the heart of his teaching. So in the first section, in chapter 5, we learn a lot about character. And Jesus says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are those who are gentle," and so forth. These 8 Beatitudes, which means blessings, these 8 Beatitudes describe the life of someone who is learning from Jesus, who's made Jesus Lord. Or we could put it this way. If we're really following God, what would God look like in our lives? How is the divine life appear in our lives? What kind of people will we be if we're going to be those who direct others to God, even remind others of God? Well, after the Beatitudes, he tells them that they are salt. You are the salt of the earth, verse 13. And you are the light of the world, verse 14. So the emphasis in this section of Scripture is on who we are, not just on what we do, but probably even more on who we are deep down. Then we have Jesus's, to some, puzzling words. "Don't think I've come to abolish the law or the prophets. I did not come to abolish, but to fulfill." Well, how does Jesus fulfill? Jesus fulfills the law not simply by dying on the cross and putting an end to sacrifices. It's much more than that. He lives out the intent of the law. He shows us what God was intending all along. And even the arc of the law, the trajectory, if the Jews had followed that law, when the Messiah came, they would have continued to grow, to mature. And Jesus is showing us God's full intention in such areas as anger management, adultery, divorce, honesty, retaliation or non-retaliation, non-resistance, loving enemies. These are tough areas. And many people have been tempted to say, we don't really have to follow them. I remember it was probably my first or second day in seminary. I just moved to Cambridge, Massachusetts, and someone was having a conversation in the parking lot as we were walking to a class and said, well, these are just interim ethics. You see, Jesus thought and the early church thought the world would end soon, and so you had to be on your very best behavior in the meantime, in the interim. And interim ethics means you weren't really supposed to live like that always. It was just because the world's about to end. But because that didn't happen, we're freed from that obligation. Well, of course, that struck me wrong back then as a very young Christian, not even 3 years old. It strikes me as very wrong today as well. In this first section, then, we see that the emphasis is on character, on spirituality. Rather than next time you're appointing a leader to a position, perhaps as an elder, a teacher, a preacher, a church planter, a missionary, an evangelist, a deacon, rather than trying to find some list of requirements, and there are some great lists of qualities that I think actually apply to all teachers, all leaders, think of character. How does this man or woman look in light of what Jesus taught here in the Sermon on the Mount? Wow, that's even harder. We go to chapter 6, and in chapter 6, we see that the Lord wants spirituality at the heart level. He gives several warnings. First, in verse 1, beware of practicing your righteousness before men to be noticed by them. Otherwise, you have no reward with your Father who is in heaven. That's hard. I mean, we may act like we don't do religious things when others are watching for their approval, but we're all tempted to do that. We're all, I think, more likely to disobey God when no one's watching than when we have an audience. Isn't that true? He gives 3 examples in the first part of the chapter. When you give to the poor, in verse 2, and then he says, when you pray, in verse 5, and then in verse 16, when you fast. So the point is that whatever we do, it's at the heart level. We're to trust in God, not material things. So he warns us about our treasure in our heart. What is our treasure? What is our heart? Are we really treasuring God, or are we seduced? Are we beguiled? Are we deceived, enchanted by the world? The end of the section of chapter 6, in my Bible, the heading is Cure for Anxiety. Oh, that sounds good. I suffer with anxiety sometimes. Well, Jesus tells us what to do. Don't be worried about your life, what you'll eat or drink, or the body, what you'll put on. Isn't life more than food and body more than clothing? And then he compares those who worry to the pagans who don't trust God. He compares those who have faith to birds and flowers who do it effortlessly, graciously. And he ends up saying, seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and don't worry about tomorrow. Well, what is the Lord saying here? We must seek his kingdom. Now, his kingdom is nothing you can localize. You can't say it's here in this place or in that place. Well, because the truth is, the kingdom is in heaven, it's on earth, it consists of the living, the dead, it's past, present, future. But the kingdom is the rule of God in our world. And right now, for you and me, it's the rule of God in our life. So seeking his kingdom, we're seeking to live an obedient life, to live the way Jesus taught, to obey his teachings, just as the ancient Jews were expected to obey Moses' teaching. Seeking his righteousness. That's the second thing we're to seek. Righteousness is not just personal salvation, that I'm dressed in his righteousness alone, faultless to stand before the throne. It's more than just that. It's more than right standing with God. In fact, in the Old Testament, the word really means justice. It's how we live, how we treat others, Again, it's at the heart. It's how we are deep, deep down. If chapter 5 focuses on character and chapter 6 focuses on sincerity, chapter 7 hits obedience. Now he begins with a call to be humble. Don't judge so you won't be judged. And then he tells us the wrong kind of judging. Of course, the Gospels are full of many examples of judging, positive kinds and negative kinds. But there's that humility. We're more eager to improve ourselves than our neighbor. We're more eager to deal with our sin than to point out someone else's sin. After that section, of course, he says, ask, it will be given to you. Seek and you will find. And that tells us something about God also. Yes, we're to obey him, but it's not just a mechanical thing. He wants us to ask. He wants to give to us. He wants to bless. Then we read about the narrow road. There are only 2 roads in Scripture, not 3, not 17. There's the broad road, where most of the world is, nearly everyone, and then there's a narrow road. But to be on that narrow road, we have to be obedient. And this is where I think so many Protestants and evangelicals get tangled up, because they've been taught that if you try to be obedient, what you're really trying to do is earn your righteousness. You're trying to earn your salvation. So they're afraid that if they try too hard, people will think that they're slipping into the Middle Ages. But that is not at all right, and that is clear overreaction. The narrow road is rejected by the false prophets. The very next verse after 7:13 and 14, there are a few who find it. The very next verse, Matthew 7:15, beware of the false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ravenous wolves. They're hungry and they will tear others apart. Well, why does the false prophet section appear right after that? Because the false prophets reject the narrow road. They're always trying to simplify it. They're always trying to water it down. But there is hope. If we live based on Jesus' word, if we build on the rock, not the sand, we'll be fine. If not, there'll be rejection and surprise. So those 3 chapters, if I were boiling it down to 3 words, which I should not do, but I am, character, sincerity, obedience. Let's move into a couple of thoughts about application. What kind of people are we? There's much more emphasis, again, on who we are than on what doctrines we believe. Chapter 5, anger. Do we treat people as stupid? Do we use disrespectful language? Okay. Do I have a radical aversion to the world, or am I trapped in lust? In 1 John 2:15 to 17, lust has many different forms. Materialism is one of the most dangerous. Divorce. Do we work through issues, or do we give up too soon? Do we fight for a marriage? Oaths. Telling the truth. Are we truthful? Are we transparent? Or are we leaders with agendas? Are we not direct? Revenge. Words, deeds, things we do, things we don't do. Do we love our enemies? Do we advocate for peace? Almost no Christian groups teach peace, teach that it's wrong to kill your enemy, including my own group. Nearly all believe it's okay to resist and kill the enemy, whereas Jesus and Paul taught very differently. Chapter 6, is my religion only to be seen? How much of it would I do if there were no witnesses, no audience? Do I really believe in God, or do I believe in the world? If I believe in the world, I'll be anxious about so many things. In chapter 7, am I judgmental? And am I seeking the Lord? And am I on the narrow road? Am I building on His words? I think you can see why through the ages, the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 5, 6, and 7, has been, well, accepted by true Christians and vigorously resisted by those who want a broader road and a more comfortable pew. Hopefully, we understand now why these teachings are regarded as the very heart of the message of Jesus. It will help us to focus not on so much what we do, though we must obey, but the kind of people we are. Righteousness, not religion. Anyone can go through the motions. Anyone can be religious. But to be righteous, we're going to have to internalize the Sermon on the Mount. Well, this is going to connect nicely with our next message. Our next two messages will be coming from the book of Hebrews, which also concerns the relationship of the old to the new. Spend some time in the Gospel of Matthew, Then maybe move on to Hebrews. We've got a couple lessons coming from there that I hope will really make a difference in your life. Thanks so much for listening. Bye.